comes a rain, with my anger comes a tide of emotion, killing joy, cutting steel across your eyes. Are you dead?
Hi, this is Brendan Davis from Bedrock Games and the Bedrock Blog, and I'm here with Jeremy Bai for another episode of the Righteous Blood podcast. And today we're going to be talking about rulings and about chases and races in Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades. And the reason is we saw that somebody had asked a question about it over at Drive Through RPG, and it's a deep enough topic. I gave the person a provisional answer, which is really my answer to the question more than anything. But we wanted to get into it deeper because I think this is an area of the game where it's highly interpretive, and both of us do tend to take different approaches to it. But before we get into the specific question of chases and races, we kind of wanted to get into rulings in general, because it's an important sort of principle of the book, I think, is this idea that for certain things we've established that rulings would be more important than us kind of laying out a codex of clarifications for this is how you handle it. We don't want to go the sage advice route of this game. We want this game to be to remain it's not like I wouldn't say that the game itself is super rules light, but we don't want it to get any heavier than it already is in the book, is the idea. So Jeremy, before we get into that, do you have any thoughts that you wanted to add, or
just that we obviously also didn't have room to just include clarifications for every little single aspect. And that said, I think you and I have but we do have differing sort of gaming philosophies in a lot of different ways, which I think was a benefit for the game because it didn't veer one way or the other. And I'm personally somebody who likes having a lot more. I don't necessarily like having a lot more rules, but I do like having a lot of things being clarified that come up as questions. And I think you fall more in the line of let the GM decide. If you go to I was curious about this as you were talking just now. I did a search for ruling in my Gmail, and it's like I have a lot of emails that come up because as we were going through the design process, I would point out something. I would say, hey, well, what about this? And then you would say, well, that's an area for a GM ruling. And as we went through, some we left as GM rulings, some we put into the GM section, some things we reworded. Yeah. But in the end, we do leave a lot of room for certain things to be interpreted by the GM or adjudicated by the GM.
Yeah, and the basic reason for that is to reduce the amount of things that the GM needs to memorize to play the game, was the idea. And also sometimes there'd be a rule and it would be like, we don't necessarily want to weigh in on this rule. Like you could interpret it this way or that way, and those are going to be very different stylistic choices, and we didn't necessarily want it to go one direction or the other for all groups for all time. And so that was another reason why we would sometimes lean on the ruling. And also, I think it was beneficial to us because we come from different perspectives and different styles to lean on the ruling sometimes for that reason. And again, the idea of rulings is actually explained in the book where, we have a whole section on it. And a lot of that, comes from ideas from people like Rob Conley and stuff like that from the Bat in the Attic blog, which I've absorbed into my own gaming over the years. But in terms of chases and races, which is for those that are following along, now that we have copies of our book, we can actually pull it out and discuss pages specifically from the book. It's in the first chapter, and let me see if I can find the page. Page 20. And so I'm going to read the text just so that we're all on the same page here. So it says, chases and races can be resolved by opposed speed rolls or lightness martial arts rolls, depending on the situation. As a general rule, when someone gets 2 wins in a row, i.e. rolls higher than their opponent twice in a row, that person gets away or catches the target. And so I wanted this rule to be really, really simple because I wanted it to be flexible enough that it could be applied differently to different situations. And I think Jeremy was on the same page with me when we did this one. And but the question that we got was really about what happens if you have one person making a speed roll and one person making a lightness roll, and how does that affect things? And so my answer to that, and Jeremy's going to give his in a moment, which will be slightly different, is I wouldn't normally have those two things rolled against each other. I would tend to take this very literally, which is it's opposed speed rolls or opposed lightness martial arts rolls. And you would determine that based on the situation. So say you have a character who bolts down an alley and he runs away from a guard. And you say, okay, that's obviously speed. So I'm going to have one character roll speed, the other character roll speed. And let's just say that that the first character is able to get some distance by rolling higher. But you still have a second roll. And that second round, the character's like, I'm going to try to leap up a wall. And then in that instance, you might say, okay, it's an opposed lightness roll to clamber up the wall. And so that's how I would generally implement it. But I think it's also meant to be flexible. A GM might say, hey, I'm going to throw in this other skill roll here to spice things up because the player said they want to do something really specific. So in my campaign yesterday, I had a player who before the chase, they were trying to set up a distraction. They knew they might be chased as a result of this distraction. In fact, that was part of the purpose. He set up an escape route and he created like a little burrow for himself to hide inside of during the chase. So I had to make a survival roll. And so during the chase itself, when the guard started chasing him, I had the guard make a detect roll against that survival roll on top of the other speed rolls and lightness martial arts rolls that were going on. And that, so I would see this rule here. Number one, just to answer the question, I would say you generally want to pick speed or lightness martial arts depending on the situation. And you can either have both of the rolls be speed or lightness martial arts, or you could have the first roll be one and the second roll be another. It depends on what's going on. If they're just chasing each other and running, or if they're leaping far distance or something like that. But also, I think that this rule is a starting point to use a little more creatively if you want to. So, Jeremy, what are your thoughts on it?
I mean, I, for the most part, just agree with what you said. And I think, just to clarify, at least from my mind, I think one of the reasons why we included, well, it made sense to include more than just one. We couldn't just have chases be based on lightness. That doesn't really make sense because there's so many possibilities for how a chase could come about. And I think you were alluding to how, as we had talked about before, why I would consider allowing both speed and lightness to be used at the same time for a chase. In other words, I would allow for one character to use speed and one to use lightness instead. The reason that I did it that way was the reason that I would do it that way, and in fact I did do it that way in the games that I have run and in which chases came up, is because I felt it would make sense for the person who was, whether it's an NPC or the player, to make their own decision about how they wanted to pursue or flee. Okay. So for instance, if you have a character that you created to be, some internal martial arts master, and then they put another point in external or something, and they don't have any lightness arts, that means that if they tried to flee from somebody using lightness arts, they would be doing it at a disadvantage. Basically, they would be rolling 2 dice and picking the lowest number. And in my mind, I'm thinking, well, what happens if that guy also happens to be a sword master who has really high speed and is just generally fast? Well, wouldn't that person realistically, instead of trying to resort to their non-existent, like, horrific internal arts, wouldn't they just try to run as fast as they possibly could with their mundane speed? And so the way that I handled it is I would allow the person who was fleeing to determine what stat they were using, whether it was lightness or speed. Mm-hmm. And then I would also allow the person that was chasing to make that same decision, because conversely, if there's let's take that example, or I think maybe a more realistic example would be somebody with high external, mm-hmm. and then a little bit of internal and then no lightness. Let's say that this person is trying to run away, and let's say that they're a swordsman and they have 3 speed. Well, let's say they're trying to run away and they're like, okay, I'm going to run and I'm just going to pound it with my legs, I am going to sprint as fast as possible in the opposite direction. And then the person that's chasing them, let's say that they're like the opposite. They have 3 in lightness and they have no speed. Well, I think it would be realistic for that person to not attempt to rely on mundane speed to try to catch this person that's running away from them, and instead, use their lightness arts. And so in that case, I would allow the person that was fleeing to use speed and the person that was chasing them to use the lightness. Now, one thing I should add to this is that I think both of us agreed a long time ago that the martial arts skills were supposed to, in most situations, trump the mundane skills, in that they're supposed to be kind of almost superhuman to some extent, and that's especially goes with the lightness. The lightness is supposed to come along with your meditation and your internal chi energy or whatever. So this is not anywhere in the book, but I think that I would most likely, in a case where it was speed versus lightness, I would give lightness a disadvantage. Either that, or I would give lightness an advantage. So in other words, if they're in that, let's imagine that situation in which there's a person with 3 speed that's running from somebody with 3 lightness, I would most likely give the person with speed a -1 d10 on their roll, just to convey the concept that lightness martial arts is sort of a superhuman feat that surpasses the mundane. So that's basically how I would handle it, not exactly how you would. In terms of what you were talking about of having obstacles and different things like that, I definitely would allow for that depending on the circumstances. But in terms of just the pure running, I would do it the way I described. And there's another situation, I'm almost done, then I'll hand it back over to you, in which I might require them to use certain things. It would obviously be dependent on the situation, the terrain and whatnot. Yeah. Like, for example, if you're trying to replicate the scene in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, where they're like, Li Mubai chases, I forget what her name is. I think they called it Jen in the English.
Yeah, they call her Jen in the English.
Right. He's chasing her through the bamboo trees. Well, obviously that would have to be lightness.
Yeah.
Conversely, I think for me personally, if there was some sort of like back alley chase where they're on the ground, and there's a lot of twists and turns with intersections every couple feet or something, it's like a maze. I personally probably wouldn't let my players use lightness. In my mind, lightness is something that requires momentum, or at least a good distance to use. So I would probably require them to use speed. Or if it was like an underground chase, like in the sewers, maybe they're crawling or something. So obviously there's circumstances where it would require speed as opposed to lightness. But
because one of the things in the game, well, first off, what penalty did you give or advantage did you give when it was lightness versus speed?
I don't think that ever came up, but if because it was always on rooftops or something, where in my games, and I don't think there was ever, I don't recall there ever being one in which it was speed versus lightness, but if that came up, I would I would most likely do a -1 to the speed is probably what I would.
Yeah, because I think there is this general idea that it trumps, like lightness would obviously trump athletics as for leaping over a roof. Like a guy who is using athletics to leap is like objectively can't leap as far as somebody who has lightness martial arts. But I think when you get into speed, and speed is a factor of lightness martial arts, it still kind of is dependent, as you can probably tell from this conversation, how the GM conceptualizes lightness martial arts. The descriptions of it that I've always kind of focused on in books and stuff is, like literally affecting the weight of your body. Do you know what I mean? Like things like that. And so that's sort of what guides my thinking in terms of would lightness or speed be more relevant in this situation. So there was an example the other night. I had 2 chase scenes in my campaign last night, and I just talked about the first one, or the second one, but the first one was actually a more comedic moment where the players were trying to get to Lee's Antiques in Owtown. They both had dueling reasons for reaching her and trying to get her to do something for them, and so they wanted to get there first. Each of them wanted to get there first. And they decided right when they were at the door to kind of try to both bolt inside. And I decided to make that a lightness martial arts situation because of the situation, almost the opposite of how you would reason it, though, where I figured, well, this guy is trying to squeeze through the door really fast. So I just sort of imagined lightness kung fu being more of a factor. But I thought if the race to get in there had started 20 feet earlier, I would have had opposed speed rolls probably Do you know what I mean? So it's just one of those things where I think a lot of it really depends on how you conceptualize these things and how you and what the specifics of the situation seem to demand for you. But I do want to point out, I think this is an area of a game where you do have to be cautious, because I deliberately chose the lightness kung fu option last night because I knew it might, or I knew it was the most likely one to irk one of my players, and I wanted to see how. Well, no, because I knew that I was going to answer this question for people, and I wanted to see how much does that bother somebody. Do you know what I mean? To get a sense of it. And he's a cool guy. He's not going to freak out at me or anything like that. But he told me, yeah, I thought it was like sort of an odd ruling. You know what I mean? So you do want to, know your players when you're making these judgments too, because ultimately, if you make a ruling that they think is unwise, that can, most groups it's still going to be fine, but it sort of deducts a point from your overall rating as a GM. It's like your Uber driver rating. Do you know what I mean? It can go up or down depending on how good your rulings are. So this is an area where, again, I would be inclined to kind of do it in a more rigid way, the way I first described, just for that reason, so that everybody kind of knows what to expect from me. But it's really, it is very dependent on interpretation. And I wanted to mention that there's a game called Doctor Who Adventures in Time and Space, and I don't know if anybody who's listening has played that, but that was the game that was kind of in my head when I was thinking of this mechanic, which you sort of have two different abilities that you can kind of choose from depending on the circumstances, and it's naturally fluid, but it naturally creates these gray zones that you kind of have to consider. Do you know what I mean? So I don't know. Do you want to add anything to that, or is that?
Well, I have three things to add, so I'm actually gonna. I should write these down. So,
okay.
Let me think. Okay, and all right. So let me touch first on what you were mentioning about lightness. I agree about the making the body light. I mean, that's in Chinese. That's literally kind of what it's referring to. That said, there are a couple scenes that have always stood out to me. One of them, I'm pretty sure it's in Smiling Proud Wanderer, the translation, the novel translation, but it's possible it could be in something else, like maybe one of the Condor Heroes, I forget. But there's a scene where
semi-gods and demi we just talked about this before, the thing too. Demigods and Semi-Devils has a character who's really fast that uses lightness kung fu.
No, it's not that. There's a scene. In fact, yeah, it's definitely Smiling Proud Wanderer, because in the early parts of Smiling Proud Wanderer, there's like these two old members of the Jianghu, and they play flute and erhu together or something. I know I'm getting this wrong. There's a part where they're in the scene and then they leave. And I vividly remember this. I mean, maybe this is a bad translation because I haven't read it in Chinese. Incidentally, I should point out. There's this part where they leave together, and it specifically says they're using their lightness arts, and then it's like I always envisioned it as like a, dong, like they were just gone.
Yeah.
It's like one moment they were here, and then the next moment they were so far away you could hardly see them.
No, and I've used that interpretation in Ogre Gate for like a lot of the techniques that do that. So I totally get what you're saying. Do you think that this would fit into? We have the discussion on know what franchise you're in the GM section. Would this fit into that? Maybe like if I'm in like a 1970s Shaw Brothers movie versus if I'm in like a TV series version of Smiling Proud Wanderer and the book Smiling Proud Wanderer, would I have different expectations? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think so. And this makes me think of, I mean, if you're gonna go in terms of movies, chase scenes, there's a big difference between the famous chase scene from Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and then the chase scene, which I think is also equally awesome, from Dragon Wuxia, the Donnie Yen movie, the 2000s one. Because in the Crouching Tiger one, they're definitely they're running up walls, they're leaping and flying and stuff, like floating up and then getting pulled back down. And then in the Donnie Yen movie, it's basically like a parkour chase scene.
Yeah.
Across the rooftops, where if they are using lightness, it's minimal at best and essentially kind of used to cushion their fall. Maybe it doesn't even imply that. It's basically a straight up across the rooftops parkour chase scene. But I think that's a good example of how you would need to make that decision.
If you
based
wanted
on
to
the
make
genre.
lightness martial arts grounded in reality, like that chase scene is the one. Like that, I think
Yeah.
that's a really good chase scene too, because it's sort of like sometimes you see these scenes, you're like, oh, they're thinking of every other scene that's ever happened in the genre, and they're like adding their own thing to it now. That's
Yeah. For me, I like in my Jianghu that I use for my games, the lightness operates more like the Crouching Tiger version with a touch of sort of like force speed. I don't know if you
Okay.
remember that scene in episode 1, Phantom Menace, where Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon Jinn kind of like race off. Like it's a little bit beyond what I think lightness is, but for me, it's kind of built into it.
But no, I've seen that in shows and I've read that in books. But again, I think it's one of these things where like this is something we probably should have talked about more in the rule book. But like every author kind of has their own physics of these things that they use, and so that's why we're kind of leaning heavily on interpretation here. And obviously, Gulong was a major source of inspiration, but I don't really have strong memories of his use of lightness kung fu compared to Jin Yong. His lightness kung fu really kind of stood out to me for some reason. Gulong always felt a little more grounded, so I tend to lean on the grounded interpretation.
I feel like in the back of my mind, I have these memories of similar things from Gulong where they're having people, speed off in the blink of an eye kind of things. But I can't come up with any example off the top of my head, so I'm not totally sure.
Okay.
But getting into the other couple things I wanted to get into, which was similar to what you brought up about skills covering different aspects or two skills. There's two things in this second topic. There's kind of two things I wanted to say, which is we had a very, we couldn't go and we didn't want to go into the realm of having a million different skills or like covering every different thing. So there's a lot of skills that we have that are going to have to by default cover sort of wildly different aspects of what would realistically be possible, and speed is one of them, because on the one, if you have gone through the rules and kind of know how the game works in general, you'll notice that our basically combat initiative is speed.
Yeah.
And the thinking behind that was that so often in these novels, in these fights, especially Gulong fights, a lot of times it comes down to who's faster.
Yeah.
And a lot of times it'll mention that, for example, Little Lee's flying dagger, I recall it constantly saying that he's faster than anybody. Nobody's faster than his dagger. And so by the time anybody can like draw their weapon, his dagger's already there in their throat. Or Afe from his kind of sidekick in Little Lee Flying Dagger, his sword is like super super fast, and so we kind of took that as inspiration, and that's why we have speed as the initiative, and we also have initiative or speed rolled every round of combat to give an advantage to people with speed. Like that's a genre trope that we were aiming for. That said, that same stat or ability, I should say, is going to cover chases as well. So obviously our speed covers both the quickness of your hand when fighting and also like your ability to sprint. And so this is going to fall into GM rulings again, where I can, if I was a GM and I had some character that it didn't make sense for them to be able to run fast, and yet they were fast with their weapon, I might, that might affect how I did the chase scene.
What was you got a third point, right? Or am I...
Right, third one. The third one was, this is just a really random aside because you mentioned the Doctor Who thing. I don't know who out there is familiar with I believe the latest edition of Call of Cthulhu is a 7th edition. They have an optional chase mechanic that's built into that system that is a little bit complicated, but it's really, really cool. So if you aren't familiar with it and you're interested in making a chase that's a little bit more complex than we have, I think it's great. I have to add a disclaimer. I've never actually played Call of Cthulhu 7th edition. Never had an opportunity to. I have the book. But it's just a really cool way of throwing in obstacles and challenges and stuff into a kind of a set predefined chase like path that can lead to, I think, I've never done it, but based on what I've heard, can lead to a very exciting and dramatic thing. So if you're a GM who's wanting to have a little bit more complicated than we've provided, I think that's a great inspiration to look to.
Yeah, no, I think well, number one, I think pulling in things from other systems is always, you know, it's always something that you can do if you need to elaborate on an existing mechanic. When it comes to our mechanic, one thing I will say is something that I do during chase scenes with this game is I will do stuff like that, and I'll just, like I kind of said, throw in another skill roll for it. So like if I want to say, oh, there's going to be like something tumbling in front of them that they have to jump over, you could, you know, ask for an athletics roll or whatever, you know, midway through. You know, that's how I would personally handle it. You know, again, that's why I'm saying that like this mechanic is the base, and people should elaborate on the base as much as they need to.
Yeah, I would say, excuse me, you know, one of the downsides to our chase system is the simplicity, and I did encounter this a couple times where it's like wuxia chase scenes can be very dramatic. Like for example, in the Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon one, which is I think probably the one most people are gonna gravitate toward, it was in terms of, if I recall, that the song, so in the soundtrack, the song is like this beating drum, like song, dun, 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 dun. Like I have the Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon soundtrack, and I've listened to it probably like 100 times. I used to listen to it when I was working, so I've listened to it a million times. Pretty sure that song is something like 2.5 minutes long. Okay. So that like on screen in sort of screen times, like a 2.5 minute chase scene that's a pretty really long chase scene, and they're like fighting and like throwing things at each other and whatnot. So our chase mechanic essentially can be over in 2 rolls, as fast as 2 rolls. And even if it's not in 2 rolls, it's going to be within a couple rolls. So it's not really designed for a super extended, like you're running across all of Beijing fighting and like doing all kinds of things. If you do want to replicate that, then you're definitely going to have to expand on it.
Well, I would disagree a little bit, only because the way that I tend to run the chase scenes is those 2 rolls are usually a lot more than just bump bump. Do you know what I mean? So there's usually like it's kind of depends on how active your players are and how active you are as a GM. If the player, like I had the player last night, he makes his roll and then he says, and I'm going to say this to the guy and try to get him to, you know what I mean? So like there's an interaction that can occur within the space between the rolls. But again, that's one of the reasons why rulings are so significant, because obviously how every group dynamics are all different, and every group kind of, the spaces in between the mechanics can be very different. So, you know, if you use it as a base and you want to add in skill rolls to produce that sort of thing, like for example, if if the GM is free to lay out the chase scene however the GM wants, right? So the GM could say like, as you're, like after the first roll, the GM could say, well, you come upon like a giant wall, like the city wall is there, so something is there, and then that initiates a choice a player might have to make within the chase scene. So I wouldn't want people to avoid those kind of things just because they're making 2 rolls. The point is that the point of reducing it to 2 rolls is so that they can have the flexibility to add that stuff in if they want to, I think. But
plus we do say as a general rule, so there's obviously room for other things. Another question that we don't answer is what happens when they catch up. So for instance, with me, I had situations, the one that jumps to mind is from the most recent session I ran, or campaign, where I had one of the player characters chasing an NPC across rooftops during a stormy night. It wasn't just a stormy night, it was actually a typhoon. I had tried to replicate Dragon Gate Inn as so I had a typhoon hit, and that was supposed to have it result with everybody staying inside, but my players of course chose not to stay inside, and so they had and incidentally the person that was being chased was Qing Yuan, who's the handmaiden of Xia Li Zhuan, who's the NPC that plays into the Pleasures of the Harbor campaign. In any case, the NPC was running out into the night, and the player chased, and so I included, I want to say athletics, because of the wind gusts. There was typhoon level wind gusts, and so every in addition to the roll in addition to the lightness roll, they also had to make an athletics roll to keep their footing. Then at a certain point, the player actually did catch up, but we don't really say specifically in the rules what happens then. So, the GM is going to have to decide. I actually left it up to the player to decide what he wanted to do. And, does he want to knock her down off the roof? Does he want to try to stab her in the back? Does he want to try to tackle her? Does he want to try to grab her robe? Like, there's so many different options. And it could result in, so in this case, it resulted in them both tumbling off the roof into a courtyard, which is kind of like what happens in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. And then going from there, it could go a lot of different ways. It could go into a full fight scene. It could go into another chase, or a lot of different things.
Yeah, what tends to happen to mine when they catch them is that's usually when the fight tends to occur, and then they might break away, and there be so it depends on like like they catch them, one person attacks, and then the other player maybe decides to keep trying to run away or attacks back. It could vary. But yeah, so I don't know. Is that everything we wanted to cover for the mechanic, or did we have other topics to go over?
I think that's pretty much it, and I think I had hoped to kind of go through the book and come up with a couple more specific examples regarding rulings, because it's such a common thing that we talked about. I didn't have time to do that, unfortunately, but suffice it to say that if there is something that is not made absolutely clear, chances are we probably realized that and left it open to GM.
Yeah.
I don't think there's very many things where we just accidentally forgot to include clarification.
No,
most of the stuff is intentionally left open for the GM.
No, because like you were saying, we had there's literally dozens of emails where we have where that comes up. Yeah, right now I'm actually I've been I was originally going to do a series of campaigns based on specific movies that were like one shots each. But then I realized I kind of want to I want to refamiliarize myself with the content because I keep switching from project to project. And so I decided to have my group all play random NPCs from the book. And then we would construct adventures around those NPCs. And so we're presently on we're on one with Thief Goddess Lee as one of the main characters, and there's another character who's a constable, another character who's kind of like a private investigator that are they're all involved in the same adventure. And
that's actually a good point that I've been meaning to mention, is that all of the NPCs in the book are created essentially the way that you would create a normal player character. So for all intents and purposes, they are all basically pre-gen characters that you can just take and play without having to do anything.
Well, that's what I wanted to comment on, actually, because I was surprised when we did it. I was like, oh, wait a second, these characters, I forgot these characters are all interlinked with each other and all that stuff. So as I started to see their characters, I was like, oh, this character would obviously probably be doing this, and this might be one of their enemies that is so a kind of rough sketch of a campaign started to take shape. A lot of it depended on what things the characters wanted to lean on, because obviously they get the character, but then it's like, well, maybe they don't want to go do the thing that the NPC says it's currently doing. So, but it basically boiled down to there were a couple of objects that people might have been going after. We also had Crimson Stargazer was one of the characters in the campaign, and that produced some interesting developments. But yeah, so but the point is, I'll be running this, in the coming weeks, and I'll probably be able to amass some examples because I'll be on the lookout for rulings things, and I can present them to you, and we can cover them on the podcast.
I think probably one of the big ones, which I'm curious to see how you handle and how other players handle. I never was able to have a campaign long enough to have the players truly take advantage of their occupation, because one of the things we say in the occupation section is that there's starting wages for all of the occupations, and we say they can increase with rank or prestige. We didn't for the most part get into those matters of rank or prestige. Again, we couldn't touch every single aspect that could possibly come up, so that's one definitely where the GM is going to have to start making decisions about how does a certain players, if a player's a constable and they're solving cases, then aren't they going to rise through the ranks? Aren't they going to get promotions? That's an area where there's definitely going to have to be some GM input.
I had a character that was an official in one of my campaigns, and we dealt with that. He was getting promotions and stuff like that. That I tend to treat that very with officials. I tend to treat it organically, and I tend to have it be rewards for doing their job. Do you know what I mean? That, especially in like the books and the movies, especially in the movies, it seems like officials advance because they made some kind of achievement. Do you know what I mean? It seems to be pretty merit based. So, and usually it's the bad guys I find that we see advancing. You do see good guys advancing, but typically wuxia heroes are not as often a part of the bureaucracy as the bad guys. So you'll have like the guy who is, it's like a fox in the hound type situation where you have the guy who grew up with the hero and has deviated from the path of good and is advancing through the imperial bureaucracy and doing bad things in order to do so. But yeah, I don't know. I handle it organically. So if they are sent on a mission and a character does an exceptional job, then that's obviously probably going to result in a promotion. And I think it would be similar for constables and things like that. For other occupations, obviously, it might be more off screen. Like, if you're a fisherman, that's not gonna, how much fishing are you really going to be doing during the game?
But some of them, like, for instance, I mean, just looking into this, like, I think in most we sort of give like, as an entry level, you'll be this, but you could eventually reach this level. For example, assassin, the thief, the merchant, even entertainers, all kind of operate on the idea that the player character is going to start out at level 1 kind of as a sort of a nobody for the most part, and then presumably as they go through the levels are going to become more and more famous. But again, we didn't,
I get
never
what you're
really
saying.
got into the mechanics of how that would work.
I tend to deal with that in terms of how much do the players actually engage advancement. Do you know what I mean? If they're just going off adventuring and they're not maintaining like a merchant empire of some kind, anything that I come up with for it is going to be it's either going to be a random procedure that I lean on to roll, or it's going to be just me making stuff up. I much prefer when the players are giving me information that I can use to assess the growth of something like a merchant empire or whatever it is. So I tend to deal with it in a very granular way. I'm not saying that's how everybody needs to. They could do it differently. You could have it just be a steady progression. But when I'm running a game like this, I tend to have all that stuff be handled by whatever the specifics within the game are. But then that said, I tend to have players that are like, oh, I want to start like Assault Empire right now, or I want to, oh, my job is this. Okay, I'm going to go to my boss and ask, like they tend to get very specific. So it can really be different, I think, if you have players that are less specific about those kinds of things.
Yeah, and I think also the GM, unless you're running like a complete complete sandbox, which I know a lot of people like to do, but if you're using adventure modules, or if you have your sort of like, if you're the kind of GM, I had somebody on Twitter a few days ago mention to me that they're planning out a 24 session campaign, and I'm like, wow, how do you plan out 24 sessions ahead of time? But in any case, the point is, like, there's a lot of people who buy the modules for whatever system it is, and it's intended to be a campaign around some kind of central idea or storyline. For instance, I definitely can see some GMs going through the adventures that we provide, Obsidian Bat and the Pleasures of the Harbor. And the thing is, those two adventures, I mean, I love them and they're great, but if, for instance, if you decided that you wanted your character to be, say, an assassin, that's cool, but neither of those are really assassin missions. The GM could tweak it to be that way, but I hate it. I've had this happen to me as a player many times where I create a very specific, unique, like, interesting character, and then the GM has an adventure that has literally nothing to do with that, and then I'm kind of like just kind of trailing along. So I personally think that the GM should give the players the opportunity to utilize, for example, if your character, you have one of your players who's like, I want to be a fisher, like I grew up in the marsh and I have my own boat, and then the GM's like, okay, so you go into the Gobi Desert on a mission, and then the fisherman is out in the middle of the desert with no way to do any fishing. Kind of just sucks for the player. So I think that at least opening the door for the player to take advantage of their prospective growth arc is, I think, kind of important.
No, I see what you're saying. So I guess for me, like, I do tend to run a lot of sandbox type games, and when I run a game like this, I wouldn't say it's like a strict sandbox where there's like hexes and stuff like that. But the way I tend to run it is like I did yesterday. I give the guys their characters, and I say, this is what, okay, this is what they're trying to do, and I kind of unleash them on the Xianghu, and it's a little bit more like a character drama because it's character driven. It's not driven by, like, let's go to this hex or that hex or whatever. It's driven more by Thief Goddess Lee has this situation she needs to resolve with so and so, and she decides this is how she's going to go try to resolve it. And so that style of play, it still tends to be very specific. So I tend to have, everything in terms of advancement within an occupation would generally be treated with specifics. And I think the other thing too is what it means is adventures like Obsidian Bat. Obsidian Bat is really there to show you how to use the rules, right? Like that's the main function of that one. And Pleasures of the Harbor is there to show you how to construct like a Gulong style mystery adventure more than anything else. But obviously any adventure that you run as a GM is going to be set around the actual characters that you have in your campaign. And so that's going to be a big difference between that and the published material. And so if I had like your assassin character in my campaign, well, number one, there'd probably be more assassin content in general. But as a player, you'd also be probably prodding me like, hey, is there anybody in this tavern that looks like they might want to hire an assassin? You know what I mean? Like that kind of stuff might be cropping up more. But also, one thing I will say is because I do tend to lean on the sandbox thing, some players might find my style a little bit aimless at times because it can get aimless if the play, if you decide to go assassinate somebody and the other characters go on this, they want to go on this other mission, and there's suddenly this thing where the party's split. That can create some weirdness. So, there are, with the style, with how I run a game like this, there are pitfalls that you have to be aware of. But I think the advantage of it is it does tend to honor character concepts quite a bit, just because the players are free to kind of push whatever it is they're trying to pursue. And then the question is, do the other players fall in line, or is there conflict over that?
Yeah.
So
another thing I wanted to mention, as I almost always do, I forgot to do all of the self-promotion. But first of all, the game the release date has been fluctuating, and it got pushed back. Then I got a message from Amazon saying that it was unpushed back.
Yeah.
I don't know what the deal is, but you can, if you're in Europe, you can get it already. If you are in North America, the physical copy is not out yet, but you can go to wherever you get your books and pre-order it or order it. If you have a local game shop, do it through them. My website, which is jeremyby.com, has links and stuff. It has a list to all of the reference material, and I have a personal blog where I ruminate on all sorts of things. And I don't think I sent this to you, Brendan. My latest blog post, I have identified, in my opinion, the top 10 wuxia movies that can be easily converted into one-shots or added as basically simple adventures. And what I mean by that is movies where you can basically watch the movie and take most or even all of the main elements and just turn it into an adventure. You had mentioned this about the movie thing.
Yeah.
So if anybody out there is looking for inspiration for that, check out my blog, and you can find it on my Twitter and Facebook and everything as well. But the reason I decided to do this little project, and I split it up into 2 blog posts. The first blog post is 5 movies, and then the second blog post, which I'll do probably this weekend, will be another 5 movies. The reason I did that is because not every wuxia movie really translates well into an adventure idea. Some of them are just, like we've talked about this on the podcast before, things like maybe Bride with White Hair, the first movie, would just be very difficult to turn into an adventure. So I decided to go through and try to find some that I thought would easily translate into role-playing material.
Yeah, I know. I saw that, actually. I was thinking of doing one on the top movies for long-term campaigns when I saw you do that.
That would be another good one, yeah.
Because I was actually thinking, Bride with White Hair is my favorite. And I feel like Bride with White Hair is a great environment. It's like a great setting, but you wouldn't necessarily be able to have the players doing what the heroes are doing in the story is the problem. So you could use it as a backdrop, or if you take Bride with White Hair 2, you can use it as the aftermath of, like, that would be a great foundation for a campaign. One that I want to throw, I don't know if, did you have this on your, did you have Lady Hermit on your list by any chance or no?
I considered that one. I didn't put on the list. It was like almost on the list, but I decided that I don't know. I felt like it was too like the way the plot went in that movie was too dependent on the personal decisions of the characters, and I felt like it would be too easy to like I did made this mistake with what I mentioned a few minutes ago with when I tried to redo or replicate Dragon Gate in, or actually it was or the fate of Lee Khan, basically the whole, in the middle of nowhere where everybody gathers. I tried to do that, and I just planned it out wrong, and it was still cool, but it went completely differently than what I was thinking.
Did I ever send you the Ogre Gate in book? Because I should send that to you so you can.
I think so. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I have that.
But I tend to see when I do so. Lady Hermit is one where I use that as a scenario before. But what I would tend to do is I would cut out Lady Hermit and all those other characters and just focus on. There's this bully that, you know what I mean. Like I'm going to focus on the Black Claw Demon guy. That's the bit that I want to use for my adventure. And so then it becomes something where the players wander into town and they can take it or leave it. They don't have to engage it, but this local bully is pushing them around and extracting, like extorting local businesses, and has the, I forget what the setup was, but basically forcing people to pay for the talisman so that they don't get murdered in the middle of the night. Things like that. I thought that would be a good setup for an adventure. So that actually made its way into the Ogre Gate book in the Red Claw Gang. That was sort of where that idea came from. But I was thinking after when I read your thing, what about like long-term campaign might be like another angle that I could take to complement that. The only question is, like, movies being what they are, it's kind of hard to assess them on what's good for a long-term campaign basis. So, I'll have to give it some thought. But yeah, so, and also in terms of promotion, I think we should mention your language guide, your naming guide, because that was, people seem to like that. I noticed that got a lot of positive reactions.
Yeah, I put a lot of work into that. It was the result of an incident. This is up on Osprey's resource page for their role-playing games, and you can find it on Drive-Thru RPG as well. It's essentially a set of tables where you can either roll to randomly generate authentic names, or you can just kind of pick what you like. It includes the definitions of the Chinese characters, which I think is helpful because you can find other Chinese name generation things online. A lot of them don't include the meaning of the names. This does, and it allows for you to create basically meaningful, authentic names. My wife helped me with a lot of it, and then my friend in China, Paul, he's also a translator. He's he and I have been friends for a long time. He's a native of the town where I spent most of my time when I lived in China. Anyway, the three of us spent a lot of time putting the guide together, and it's free. So whether you're making names for Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades, or just for writing stories or any other game system, it's going to be a way to. I think I calculated it, and I think my math isn't that good, but there's something like 50,000 name possibilities, or maybe it's 100. I forget. There's a lot.
Yeah, no, that's one of the best one. It's probably the best one for this genre that I've ever seen, because like it's I don't know, it's a perpetual problem, we'll say, for tables, and I've tried. I mean, and we had another name generator that we gave to people that you and I put together for that book. But and that one was great, but the only problem was it didn't get to that 50,000 level of possibilities. And so, this one's got so many things in it. And I don't think you need to even play our game to find use for it. If you are playing a wuxia campaign of any kind, it'll be handy.
Yeah, for sure. It has. I don't have it in front of me. I think it has something. I think I included something like 10 tables for surnames, and then like 15 tables for given names. And so,
but
it's.
I just want to mention too, the other thing you did that I don't think I've ever seen on these tables is you give like the connotation of the name, Do you know what I mean? Like, and I don't mean like the literal meaning. I mean, you're like, this is like a good name for a hero, or this is a good name for a bad guy, or this, that's stuff that is really elusive to people that don't speak the language. So
yeah, I have thematic names, and then also names based on occupation. The thing is, this happens a lot in the wuxia books. The many times, especially with Gulong, he has a lot of names which are clearly not particularly realistic. It's kind of like if you have I don't know, off the top of my head, you have like a thriller novel, and then your hero's name is like Jet Rifle or something like that. It's
which
like,
we do that a lot.
So it's not as so unrealistic in Chinese that I would translate it as a name, but it's at least kind of unique enough to be something out of the norm. And so I have all that stuff in there, and I think it's totally possible to make some very authentic and meaningful names. And the Chinese characters are in there as well, so you can always copy and paste them out to, print it, do art, look it up online, find pronunciation, like even just Google Translate online. You put the Chinese characters in there, hit the button, and it'll read it for you. There's other tools that do that, but that's free and easily available. So it's easy to hear it pronounced relatively correctly. So yeah, check that out on either Drive-Thru RPG or their site.
Okay, all right. So yeah, definitely check it out. Definitely let people know if you like the game too. Like that's word of mouth is so important. We just saw that there was another review up of Righteous Blood, and those are always really helpful to us. So definitely get the word out. And until next episode, we will talk to you later.
With the laughter comes the rain. With my anger comes a tide of emotion, killing joy, cutting steel across your eyes. Are you dead or insane as you start